Okay, in this session, I want to talk about Agile's version of requirements capture called user stories. There's a lot of misconception about user stories, what they are, what they represent, and the process by incorporating them into your Scrum, particularly your sprint planning, as well as when we get to the sprint review. So this is the last of the beginning, excuse me, modules on Agile before you start your project. We talked about kind of the overview of the Agile culture and philosophy. We talked about Scrum in particular and the machinery of Scrum. Um, and now we're going to talk about user stories because user stories are going to be that currency, if you will, by which you're going to fill up your product and sprint backlogs to guide your work. So let's go forward and talk about user stories. So what are user stories? Well, physically, tangibly, traditionally, what you've done with a user story is write them on a 4x6 index card. So you take out traditional index card and you write down the story. Now, if that's not enough room, I mean, it's a 4x6 index card by design. If that's not enough room, then it probably means that you have too much detail in it and that the story is too long. It could be something that needs to be broken up, or it may not be a user story at all. You may be trying to write a more traditional form of requirements than a user story itself. And the reason for that is the point of the story is to capture a conversation. Um, you're going to take a requirements class and you'll talk about different ways of representing requirements: formal modeling, natural language, templated structured language, use cases, scenario driven, all various forms of trying to document requirements. But what are you really trying to do? When you're really trying to build a solution for someone, any kind of solution, the first thing you need to have is a rich interaction with one or more people to understand their problem, so you can come up with that solution. And so Agilists believe that the important part is that conversation. That conversation, our rich interaction between people, where they arrive at a common understanding of something in their mind, is what's important. And so that conversation needs to be represented. So what's written on the user story card is not supposed to be the requirement per se, it's a proxy for the requirement. It's supposed to remind the developers of that conversation, or remind the product owner and the customer of that conversation, that common agreement they came to when they had it. Okay, um, that's the main part of the user story. Additional things that often go on there is to define or identify, should not define, identify the user role. Who wants that story? So in a sense, be goal driven. Who was that you had a conversation with? So normally it's a role in the system. As a student, I want a grade book I can render on my smartphone. All right, that student, identifying that role is important. The other part is an acceptance test. Because it's a proxy for a conversation, when developers are doing it, they have to turn into some tangible sense of how you know when you're done. What does done look like is the question. And that's what an acceptance test is supposed to be. If I pass this test, then the need expressed in a conversation represented by the story has been met. Okay, so let's take a look at what that actually looks like. Here's an anatomy of a user story, and this is kind of a blue sticky note kind of thing, right? And by the way, there isn't strict rules on this. I mean, you can go to different places, and their stories might be a little bit different, and I'll point out some things. But this gives you kind of an overview and anatomy of how these things are done. And by the way, a popular thing now, and we've done this in our physical classrooms as well, is to use those super sticky notes you can get at like Staples. Um, the super sticky post-it notes, because they're really good, they're really sticky, and set them up on your wall. So if you go back to the Kool-Aid notes and see the picture of the Scrum board on there, you'd see a lot of sticky notes on the board, because people literally take these things when they're agreed upon and stick them up. Now, another reason, by the way, I mentioned this before I talk about this anatomy. Another reason why it's written on an index card isn't just physical size. It's because it's very transient. It's very manipulable, meaning you don't invest a lot in writing it down and tracking it and everything else, meaning I can pick up the card, and if it doesn't make sense, I rip it up. It doesn't go into the product backlog. It never appears in the Scrum backlog. Maybe it was written poorly. Maybe it was too large. Maybe it was too small. It's passed around the team and the customer. It's negotiated over, as we'll talk about. And so the index card metaphor is because, I can pick it up like a small piece of paper, just zip, zip, and it's gone, if need be. Okay. Okay, so anatomy. What kind of things go on a user story? First, a short title, capturing what it is, and then the story itself. The story itself in this one, the title is Edit SR Detail Screen. The story is Add a Cancel button to undo changes and return to previous page. There is a user acceptance test there. Check that the browser returns to correct previous change. And there's an identifier of what story number it is. There is a date when it was created. That's just a little bit of metadata in the corner of the card. And then you see estimated in actuals there. And this one's actually estimated in hours, although we usually use the concept of story points. Now, from an anatomy perspective, in terms of what goes on a user story, this is typical. Those are the parts, if you will. And notice it's all very lightweight. The estimate is scribbled down. The identifier is just a sequence number. It's not some complex GUID tracking system online yet. It's all in pencil and paper, if you will. And the language is brief and to the point. Now, in terms of how some of these components are actually written, and next I'm going to talk about best practices, but I'm going to point some of these things out here before I walk you through them. First is I don't actually like this story very much because it doesn't focus on capturing a conversation per se. And one of the things it has on it is it mentions something specific on GUI. Now, if that GUI already existed, it should be referenced here. But essentially, you're trying to avoid language that leads the development team to a specific implementation. Right? What if it's not supposed to be named cancel or whatnot? So when I write user stories, I try and stay away from referencing specific assumed design or implementation features because that should be left to the developers to decide. But not that big a deal, and some folks write them that way. The other part is you see as part of the story, and I've pointed to at the bottom here, a common template. This is, again, not a rule, it's more a convention. It's a practice that a lot of folks are doing, is to write a story using the template. As a user, I want to do something to achieve this benefit. And that brings in our concept of a user role. It says what's supposed to be accomplished, what actually needs to be done. And it also indicates what the benefit is. It gives a notion of that business value. Right? I mean, we want our customer when they're writing these stories with us to be able to express why this is important to them, right? And by using a template, it should remind us of that conversation because those kind of things should be covered in that conversation. I should know who it's for. I should know what it is to be done, and I should know why is that important. Okay. The other part on here that I'm not a big fan on is the estimate in hours. Now, estimation and tracking is something we're going to talk about at the end of at the end of one of our sprints, beginning next sprint, and we'll talk about how it's done in Agile. But in general, estimating and tracking projects in any software engineering project of any manner of complexity is really, really hard. In SCR316, you should have done a little flavor of the personal software process and done your own personal estimation practices. And even then, that's hard, right? So it's very hard for folks to estimate and actually get down hours and so forth. It's also hard to estimate $sign for a customer. Can I take this independent feature and assign a $sign to it? I know it's important to have. I know it may be more important than this other thing to have, but can I actually put a $sign on it? No, I probably can't. But I do have a notion of how much more important it is than something else. And if I'm a developer looking at a story, I probably could read a story and have an idea of how much more complex this is or is not compared to something else. So really the best practice for your estimated and your actuals is to do it in terms of what's called story points. Story points are a relative indicator of value. Okay. So if something is twice as important as something else, then one of them I'd assign 10 story points to, another one I'd assign 5 to. There's some techniques around doing this. We will talk about some story point estimating techniques in the next sprint. We'll talk about planning poker. We're not going to do that now. For now, I want you to do kind of just what feels right. Another common practice is to use Fibonacci numbers, because in a Fibonacci number, 0 plus 1 equals 1, 1 plus 2 equals 3, 3 plus 5 equals 8. It's kind of this skipping mechanism where you can use it relative to something else, because the next number in the sequence is additive from the previous two numbers. So you can kind of get this idea of for comparison, and and you're really just trying to get a feel for how big the box is. And it's considered a best practice now because, frankly, trying to estimate to any greater level of detail or fidelity, we just can't do it. We just can't do it well. So usually those things are in story points. We'll also talk about another thing called t-shirt sizing, right? So another way of sizing is, and a lot of times the development team will do t-shirt sizing. Basically, that's going to be really complex. That's double XL complex. That's XL complex. Oh, that's small. That's not that complex. The customer needs to estimate value. The developers need to estimate complexity, which indirectly means it's probably going to be more effort. So the developers can understand how much they can bite off and chew in a sprint, and customers understand how much value they're getting. And we're going to talk about that at the end of this talk. But let's return to what a user story specifically is, and the best practices associated with it. So here's some best practices, and basically the next few slides are collected from various expert practitioners in the field. So I kind of collected these things around. I give you some URLs where appropriate, so you kind of understand what these folks are saying. It's not, what I'm trying to say, it's not textbook. There is no one best way. There is a community of practice, if you will. So sharing some of those thoughts, Ron Jeffries, an extreme programmer who runs his own site with a very prolific blogger on a number of Agile topics, a lot of good reads in there. But he has one that's very well known that he did a number of years ago on the 3 C's of user stories. The card, the conversation, the confirmation. First, the card is a token representing a requirement. A token's a thing, right? It's the string around your finger. It's a token. It's a thing that represents something else. That's the proxy I was talking about. It's not the requirement itself. All right. The requirement is like software. It's not something you can reach out and touch. So we create a tactile representation of it that we call the user story, and that token represents the requirement. That requirement is actually expressed as a conversation, right? And a conversation is a back and forth exchange of thoughts, opinions, and feelings. And in fact, that conversation, we naturally sometimes think of a conversation as a one-on-one chat with somebody, but it can be one-to-many, like I'm doing with you now. It can be many-to-many. So there's not just one format, but it is. The conversation point is all the exchange of all those things so that we come to a common understanding, as I was saying before. And then we need some confirmation. We need to know that when we took that common understanding and we went off and we did it, that we actually did what you wanted. We thought we understood, but we need confirmation. So the acceptance test is supposed to represent that confirmation. And if you don't have it, you don't have any representation of it at all. One of the most problematic things in software is not implementing something that's correct or within a certain defect rate, defect free, if you will. Well, there's no such thing as no bug software, but having an acceptable rate of defects in terms of just actually running the software. It doesn't crash, it doesn't compute the wrong value. It's really what's called validation. The ability to validate that what you actually built is what the customer wanted, what the user needs. All right, so confirmation is supposed to be one of our safeguards to facilitate a validation process. That means we're going to build what the customer wants. It doesn't mean we're going to be 100% right either, even with the acceptance test mechanism in place. But if we are acting in accordance with, consistent with the conversation, with the common understanding, hopefully we'll be successful. We being developers, we being customers as well. Okay, well, how do you get the user story? Well, you got to have the conversation, all right? And I say that may sound a little obnoxious, but part of the reason I put that in there is some folks think that the user story is, well, go tell the customer to go sit down and write them because customers write the stories, right? Just go tell the customer to write some things down on index cards and we'll take them and we'll go implement them, right? No, that's not actually user stories, right? There has to be a story there. Meaning you got to have the conversation. You have to sit down and talk to people to express their needs and their wants and their desires, their thoughts, opinions, feelings, as Jeffrey says. And then the user story comes in after, the index card comes in after as that representation of it. All right. So again, because the card is not the requirement itself, it represents the requirement. You can't just say, oh, I'm going to take out a card and write something down. You got to have the conversation. How do you have the conversation? Well, there's all kinds of techniques, and you're going to spend time in these techniques when you take 415, because these techniques are by no means specific to Agile methods at all. They've been around for a long time. Conducting an interview, using surveys so you blast it out to a lot of people, using some kind of workshop, group-oriented activity, a brainstorming, an idea generation, idea reduction, all these kinds of techniques. That's not the topic of this class, but again, I'm just trying to point out that there's more than one way to have a conversation. In requirements engineering, that's called elicitation, but actually realize that elicitation is a bad word to Agile folks, particularly to extreme programming folks, because elicitate, what does the word elicit mean? The word elicit means to bring forth, right? To bring forth latent information, let's say, out of your mind. And from extreme programming folks, to them it kind of applies something like the user's hiding something from me and I've got to go hunt for it and find it. Instead, they use the analogy of trawling for requirements. And trawling is kind of, imagine you're you're the fisherman in the boat. You're dragging a net behind and you're scooping up all the fish of the right size, letting the ones that are too small filter through. The ones that are too big, you throw back because they're too big for the net. So the trawling thing is meant to say that the requirements are there. The conversations can be had. You just have to write them down. You just have to capture them. But it also has that notion of the right level of granularity. Something that is too small is not a user story. Something that is too large is not a single user story. It's either something called an epic, which I'm not really going to get into in this class, or it needs to be broken up in some way to multiple stories. The second thing is ask the right questions. When you're having the conversation with the customer, and really this kind of goes both directions, I think. The conversation should be open-ended and context-free, which means you're not trying to constrain the conversation. You're not supposed to say, well, let's talk about something, but you can't talk about this, that, the other thing, or in this particular way. All right? Conversation, exchange of thoughts, opinions, feelings. It is, get to that common understanding using the power of natural language and conversation to do it. So don't try and create some artificial constraints around the conversation in hopes that you converge. If you have a conversation you can't come to a common understanding, that's not a user story's fault. All right? Something else is going on. You got to use a different technique. There are convergence techniques for things, but it's not meant to be, I'm going to constrain. So you can't express something that you want. Okay? Okay. Another paper by William Wake in 2003, which is still referenced, is the INVEST acronym for characteristics of good user stories. So INVEST, the acronym means I is for independent, does not depend on other cards. So one thing is, and this is an assumption I don't really like, is when you're doing these index cards, you don't write this index card to say, well, this one depends on that one. The user story shouldn't have language that says, after I do story 25 over here, then I can do this, right, kind of thing. Meaning, that I should be able to, because when I take the cards and I want to reorganize, negotiate, break them up, and so forth, I don't want to be tightly coupled. I don't like this personally because I think it wishes away a fundamental element of complexity. Requirements are in fact often dependent on each other. They only have value when considered as a collection, not as an independent requirement. And conversations don't naturally just we'll talk about this, we'll stop, we'll talk about that, right? We talk about something and then it kind of leads to, and yeah, because that's tied to this over here and we need that too, and this, and you kind of bounce around, right, if you think about it. And so I'm not a big fan of the independent assumption. It kind of pervades a lot of Agile thinking, even when we get to the Scrum boards. There are some techniques and safeguards and things you can try and do about it. But this one I don't know if I agree with. But this is part of the invest practice, if you will, and a lot of people believe in it. Negotiable. Business and developer will negotiate over these. And I'm not going to talk about this now because we're going to talk about that negotiation process in a little bit. Valuable. All right. If you're looking, and this happens in a lot of requirements processes, somebody wrote something down at some meeting and made it, and it turned into a use case. It turned into a documented requirement in the document somewhere. And then people look at it weeks later, months later, and say, well, how'd they get there? Who wanted that? Who found that valuable? So that's part of the writing of the requirement. As first you want the date, you want to know when it was done, and you want to know, as a blank, as a student, as an instructor, as an accountant, as a nurse, who's it valuable to? By stating the user role, that person is supposed to get some value. The other part is, and I should go back up to here, what I'm talking about is this at the bottom. As a user, I want to do something so that benefit. Realize that this, the user part tells me who finds it valuable. And I hit the wrong button on my thing, so I'm trying to fix that. Sorry. So who finds it valuable? And that's why we also have the benefit on here. Again, as a student, I want a mobile grade book so I can get up-to-date information about my grades in a class. All right, what's the benefit and who's it beneficial to? All right, it has to be estimatable. I mean, if it's written in such a nebulous way that it doesn't conjure up what the actual need is, then the developer can't assign an estimate to it. Now you see the acronym there. The acronym there, IET, stands for Idealized Estimated Time. What that basically says is, if IET is a concept, and again, we're talking more about estimation later in this course, but IET basically says, and I think you saw this, you should have seen this in the personal software process. It says if I sat down with absolutely no interruptions whatsoever, I didn't have to go to the bathroom, I didn't have my coworker bothering me about last night's football game, I didn't get an email or a text, my wife didn't call me, I didn't, you name it, I don't have to go to sleep. If I just sat down and just solved that problem and provided that solution, how long would it take? All right, that's what IET means. But from our perspective, it just means that however it's constructed with the story and the acceptance test, that it's enough that a developer can actually assign one of these relative estimated values to it. Small. Large stories are complex and incomplete, hiding assumptions. Consider splitting if it's too large. And that really is the case. I mean, and there's a lot of discussion in the community about scaling Agile. But in effect, if I had to choose between having stories that were too large or too small, I'd probably choose having some that are too small. Because at least they're done quickly. I can scope them out. I can understand them. It might make a lot of noise on my Scrum board, but I can handle them. Whereas if something's large and I'm trying to capture a large and complex conversation on an index card, then there's probably a lot of stuff I'm leaving out. And there's probably other aspects. I'm probably not going to be able to understand its true value or estimate it, negotiate over. It's probably not independent to other things. In fact, I probably have a rat's nest of interdependent things tied up into this really large story. So we try and keep them small. And then finally, testable. Part of the thing about writing an acceptance test and writing the acceptance test at the time that the story is written, not saying, oh, we'll go write the test later and figure out how to test it later, is that is kind of an immediate translation of the conversation into a form that says there's some way I know that I can validate this. Again, I talked about that notion of validation. And if I punt that down the road, I may not, then whatever I come up with for an acceptance test may be wrong, right? Or I may just never get to it, frankly. And then you don't really know what done like. Somebody says, well, I did a bunch of stuff and I think it's good enough and I'm done. Well, no, you're supposed to pass an acceptance test and make that tangible back into your code, and we'll talk about unit testing concepts, in order to know that, hey, I passed the test, so the story is present in the system and it's what the user wants, what the customer wants who gave you the story. So I think that's particularly important. Okay, moving forward. More best practices. Again, I told you I was going to tell you about, give you some best practices from different authors. This one's from Mike Cohn. Mike Cohn's, I mean, maybe the expert in user stories. This book, User Stories Apply, came from 2004. But, Cohn literally wrote the book on them, and that's a great book. I have it on my bookshelf. I'm paraphrasing a set of, top 10 list of guidelines, but I suggest if you're interested in this kind of stuff in depth, this might be a book you want to look up and get a copy of. So some guidelines, some places to start with. And by the way, these are things I hope that you look at when you have to sit down and write your own stories for your project. One is start with goal stories. Meaning, start with some objective the user's trying to accomplish. We kind of have a natural tendency to, want to think of, well, what do we need to do? And you start writing stories around what do I need to do, right? So when I initially work with students, I see a lot of initial Scrum boards that say things like, I need to go create a database. Well, creating a database is not a goal unto itself, right? The goal is that a system needs some form of persistence for somebody for some benefit. So start with that goal. Creating a database is just one task out of helping achieve that goal. Slice the cake. Think of end-to-end functionality. Try not to decompose. And again, you'll talk about this in your requirements class. But it's very important that you understand you're working in the problem space. When you're talking about the user story and the capturing of that conversation, you're talking about something a user needs, which means it's when you start thinking about the design of your system, or if you're thinking about the design of your system too early, you have this desire to again start thinking toward the solution. Oh, I need to create the database. I need to deploy it on the cloud. I need to define a schema. I need to write these tables. I need to create these constraints. I need a way to import data into it. I need a way to define the queries to get data out. And you're decomposing the problem functionally or in some other decomposition mechanism, and you're starting to call those things stories. Well, no, they're really not stories. The end user need was persisting data. Those things that you're doing, that decomposition, is what the developers need to do to create tasks to make the story real in the system. All right, and we're going to talk about defining tasks as well. But in terms of writing a good user story, don't be afraid of that. That user story should, in fact, touch on several different envisioned components of the architecture of your system. All right. Put constraints on cards. All right. If there is a constraint. Now, again, I talked before about not inventing constraints. That was constraint on the conversation. But if, in fact, there is some constraint of the scenario, of the conversation, make sure that's documented too. If that cancel button was only supposed to be added when under a certain time frame or something like that, or to certain types of users, then put those things on the cards, right? This is like the business rules sections of a use case document or the non-functional requirements captured in a more traditional requirements document. But explicitly identify the constraints under which it applies. Sometimes folks just kind of leave them off, and then the developers are just going to assume that you do this in every possible place at every possible time, and that may not be correct. Size the story to the horizon. And this one I don't know how much I agree with this one either. But if in effect, if you know something doesn't have, what you're going to do is you're going to create a whole bunch of these stories and fill up a product backlog. You're going to spend more time and add more detail, like the acceptance test, like in particular the estimate, and perhaps you're even going to consider rewriting the story in a better way. The closer you know this is going to get to the sprint backlog. So we're going to talk, those things are going to go on the product backlog. But if you know there's something out there that doesn't add as much business value to the customer as something else, you know the team's not going to get to it for a while, don't spend a lot of time on it. So, we already talked about in the concept of a Scrum, of having this rhythm, this cadence to, the Scrum Master makes decisions to keep the team moving, this notion of velocity, always moving, always turning the crank. It's kind of the same in the user story world. If you have to sit there and have a long conversation, repeated conversation, somebody's tempted to do some detailed analysis about something to understand the story may be too long, too complex, whatnot, or maybe that conversation is not that important to happen in the first place. The customer could tell you, this isn't that important right now anyway. All right, well, keep the card, mark it as such, and put it in the back of the backlog and worry about it if it ever makes it toward the front of the queue. As They said keep the UI out as long as possible. I agree with this one. Cohn's got this one, but we saw it in our user story. It was in there. And again, that may be because you're closer to implementation, so that detail is required or necessary. Maybe that one represented an incremental requirement to an existing system. But certainly if you're doing a new project, and you don't want to prohibit design on your user stories, right? And part of design is, as you know from 315, is the user interface design, the user experience design. So try and keep the user interface out as long as you possibly can, until it becomes just too much detail and you have to put it in. Realize that some things aren't stories. A lot of Agilists will, I mean, there's a number of mechanisms for, and I'll talk about some of them as well during this semester, for expressing things that aren't really conversations with the customer, but getting them on your Scrum board so that you can track the work with one tool. That's really the motivation for that. So maybe you do have some setup, some infrastructure work, some research work to do. And the dev team really needs that done, but can't really associate with a specific story. So you can create something called a zero value story. There's no business value to it, but the team has to do it as part of ramp up. That's an example of what I mean. That's not really a story. It's not really a conversation you have with the customer. It's not represent a direct need of the customer, but it is something that needs to be done. There may be non-functional requirements that are very difficult to write as user stories. In pure Agile parlance, there should be some other place that those things are captured, not on the Scrum board. But in practice, just most organizations like to have everything on the Scrum board because it becomes that information radiator we talked about. And so they'll find a way to kind of rig it so that these things that aren't really placeholders for conversations appear as user stories anyway, just kind of specially tagged. You'll see some of this as we go forward. Again, we've talked about including user stories, user roles and stories. We talked about that, all right. Write for one user, trying to eliminate classes of users, trying to eliminate that ambiguity. Write in active voice, right? A job seeker can post a resume, not a resume can be posted by a job seeker. Again, there's this whole, well, first, better writing style in active voice, but this notion of action, momentum, things you do. So that's a way I would write the user and the action, and then I should probably add a job seeker can post a resume to the benefit of landing a job, right? Or allowing a job hunter to be able to see their skill set. All right. Best practice customer rights. Again, that's something depending on, you would hope that your customer is involved in this process directly, meaning sitting around a table with you, and then after you have the conversation, that you'd actually give the pen to the customer and have the customer write them. In practice, I still see that there's a role for a business analyst, probably trained in Scrum, or an Agile method, who's actually capturing the conversation. But certainly everybody should agree with how the user story is written, and agrees that how it's written reminds them of the conversation that they just had of the need, right? I worry a little bit that when you assign writing to the customer or a developer, that what happens is, the conversation doesn't happen like I said before. People just write it, put it into a queue, and say, I'm done, all right? Critically important. It's actually something that won't happen in this class because you're not working with actual customers, but in a real not approximated version of doing Scrum, or any user story driven process, you really need to have the conversation. The user story is not the requirement, the conversation is. All right. Moving forward, so this is the part where we get to the negotiation, all right? Kind of what happens next, if you will, as part of this process. So we have a user story, we follow best practices, we like how they're written, we kind of have a pile of them. The next part is to negotiate over them, all right? So how does that work? Kind of the process. Well, first, customer defines value. So you write the story, and then you got to assign those story points. The story points, again, a relative value, all right, so used for comparison, so that the customer has some means by expressing how important something is to him or her. Next step is the development team programmer estimates the cost. So another relative estimating technique, and again I talked about things like t-shirt sizing, It could be hours if you want, but the real point is it's still a relative estimate, just like story point estimating should be, of how complex this is, how much work it's going to be for the team. Go back to the customer. The customer then gets to say, okay, I have value. I have developers saying this is how complex it is and roughly what it'll cost me, if you will. So I've got a cost benefit, informal, ratioed, relative relationship here. But I get to choose. All right. The developers don't get to say what goes into a sprint backlog. The developers get to say, the customer gets to say, okay, you told me what you can pull off. Maybe you gave me a few different options, a few different sets of these things. I get to choose the value. And then the developer team goes builds it. All right. That exercise is, once you have the set of stories selected for a sprint, okay, wrote the stories, we put them on the product backlog, we estimate value, they're prioritized, we grab the top ones off the sprint, the customer defines that value, or chooses that value. Then the development team looks at those stories that were chosen and says, okay, how are we going to build it? And the part of the Scrum board that the development team owns is the part where the tasks are defined. The part of the board that the product owner or customer defines is the part where the stories appear. Okay, and so the board in a sense is partitioned in that way. There's some variance in this. For example, when choosing value, normally what I have my development teams do is understand what requirements what conversations might naturally be related to each other, what efficiencies you might get in development. Meaning, if requirements A and B both involve some aspect of that database development we were talking about, but story C involves a user interface, even if story C is more important than A or B, I may still choose to do A and B at the same time. I want to get them into the same sprint because I anticipate that there'll be related work going on in my tasks, and so I can lower the cost associated with it. So again, in a number of agile shops, I see them kind of just do story points. That they basically, there's only one estimate. In my mind, the best practice is the best way of doing this is to have actually two estimates: the estimate of value and the estimate or benefit, and the estimate of work or cost. Right, and so the prioritization that happens to determine what goes in a sprint is this cost benefit trade-off. All right, so maybe there are higher value stories that are left in the product backlog if the development team changes its cost based on what you do together. So this bottom part of this graph can be a bit more complex negotiation to understand alternatives, and that's why I say down here options. Those options are really, the development team shouldn't just present individual stories back to a customer. In my mind, they define sets of stories that would make sense for a sprint and fit with the velocity or capacity of the team. And then the customer comes back and says, okay, let me pick among those options. Or can I talk you into another, or whatever. It's a negotiation. Once that negotiation is done, both sides kind of have learned some things through that negotiation as well. One of the things that's nice about this negotiating process is, it kind of creates a win-win situation. It develops trust between customer/product owners and Scrum teams. It develops trust between chickens and pigs, right? And everybody gets more committed. And it's been shown, no matter whether you're doing Agile, whether you're doing an older technique called joint application development, that when Barry Beam published a very well-known software engineering paper on Theory W, win-win strategies. And maybe you've heard that term, and maybe it sounds like a little fluffy business term. But in reality, win-win's a very important concept. If both sides feel like they win by working together, you react to change, which is what Agile's about better. because you're both interested in getting the problem solved, not in assigning blame to each other. And so this negotiation process, this process of sitting down and having these conversations and then negotiating over and understanding, what the value is to the customer. At the same time, the customer understands the complexity involved in doing something and maybe why you would want to do things. Things can be at lower cost in different ways. Now it's not we're arguing over the details of a contract. It's we're on the same team. We're not a contract negotiation where we have two sides across the table from each other. Everybody's on the same side of the table. Everybody wins and builds that trust. Because when things come up, even during the sprint implementation, that trust is something you can leverage and to work with your customer and to go back and say, look, maybe this issue arose or something. And it's a two-way street. Maybe the customer has a real change in their business environment and needs to do something different right away, and you're going to be more accommodating if you truly understand the customer's needs. Okay, that's going back to some of the culture and philosophy. But how do user stories, once negotiated, fit back into Scrum? And I've been talking about this as I've been talking about the user stories, but really we need to kind of go right back to the mechanisms we talked about last time. So let's go back to them. There's our Scrum model in the abstract, right? This was first or second slide in the last talk. And we talked about how we're going to just get on this rhythm cadence of the conveyor belt of doing things, right? Well, what do? The first thing we do down here, once we have the user stories and we've assigned their value to them, and really I only need the value to them, is they first go on the product backlog. And again, the product backlog exists as long as the product exists. And you can actually, normally these things are done in this big sprint planning meeting, but in fact, the conversation could happen anytime. The story could be added as a placeholder for that conversation. Maybe there's a chance meeting with the customer. Maybe the customer schedule didn't fit exactly on the 30-day rhythm of a sprint. And you have a conversation. You can still add a stack of cards with story point value on them to the product backlog. All right, doesn't mean the team works on them right away. What's going to happen is in the sprint planning process, when you sit down, developers are going to tell you what the cost of building different value is, and you do that negotiation we just talked about, and that defines what actually gets put on the conveyor belt during this time period. All right, and that's the trusted agreement. That's the promise the development team makes to build the value, and now they go forward and figure out how to do that. The end result is when you're done with the sprint planning, you should have a Scrum board that looks like this. And I use this because I didn't use the physical Scrum board with the sticky note. I didn't use a picture like that because I actually wanted to give you a preview of the Scrum board you're going to be using in this class. It's an online tool called Taiga, T-A-I-G-A. Taiga.io is its URL. And this is how it virtually represents a Scrum board. Down the left are your user stories. You can see they have points associated with them. You can have a title. I actually made my titles fit our template language, so that way you would see it on here. When the title is different, you actually have to double click on it to see it. So as an instructor, I can apply a recipe to the student teams in a particular course. You may not even know what that means because you weren't part of the conversation, right? This conversation, this is actually, I'm the product owner for this. This is a research project that 3 of my graduate students are working on, and we actually use this stuff. And this is a sprint that, at the time I record this, is just started. We just went through this planning. So what you see here are the stories down this side with their relative story point assignments. Now, what are these things where it says new, in progress, ready for test, and closed? In detail, new means these are new tasks. All right, so these yellowish ones are tasks to do, and they can be written in a way that the developer understands what it means. So to do this story, we need some UI modifications. To do the one as a user, I must authenticate to the CSS system to protect my privacy. Okay, what does the team need to do? Well, we've got to go in and modify HVD to include the auth module. We've got to support a redirect to CSS via a token. We've got to validate the token against the auth module. You don't know what any of this stuff means, right? Doesn't matter. The development team, right? My 3 graduate students have to know what that means. The development, the customer or product owner owns this. They own that, and that's been negotiated over, so their part's done. In the period of the sprint where you build value, the development team owns this. Meaning the development team gets to create whatever task they need that they think works. If a task no longer seems to make sense, they delete it. If new task makes sense, I'm 2 weeks into a sprint and now I realize I need to do something else, you write it and you write the task and you put it on here. That is entirely the purview of the team. Now everybody has visibility on this. All chickens, all stakeholders may see what's going on, but a project manager, a traditional project manager, a scrum master, a product owner can't go in and say, I don't want you to do that. I want you to do this. Or can you do this first? That's not how it works. The development team owns the task board. They decide what things they're going to pick up next and put to in progress. When they put them in progress, that means a person, an actual developer, gets assigned to that task. There's all kinds of theories of what the best way to move tasks. I mean, basically the goal is to complete tasks, move them across the board, and when all the tasks for a particular story, let me get rid of this. Let's say this one's still, oops, that's supposed to be my eraser. Let's say this one's still, dang it, not sure, hold on a second. Oh, there's my eraser. Let's say that one is still valid. When all the tasks go across the board, then presumably this story is done, and in a sense I'm ready to go do the acceptance test for the story, and if the acceptance test passes, then I can close the story, and I'm done, and I've built actual value for the customer. So there's a difference here. I mean, remember we talked a little bit about task activity networks and traditional project planning. In traditional project planning, the project manager, perhaps with a tech lead type of person, tries to go through and create all these tasks and order them and put them on a very fixed schedule and time frame when they're supposed to be done. That doesn't happen here. Development team themselves own this. This is how we know what we need to do to get our work done. We've made the commitment to do it, so we're not going to do it in that schedule. Now, it doesn't mean you can't track work. Each one of these tasks usually has its own estimate measured in a lot of times hours in actual time, maybe measured with relative sizing again. But very often you will actually take tasks and say, oh, how long is it going to take me to modify HB to include the auth model? Oh, that's only going to take me an hour. How long is it going to take me to program a redirect in? Oh, that might take me 4 hours, right? And then you get a sense of your resource requirements for the particular sprint. So that kind of tracking can be done. And then you can also just track how much value is being built. And that's all I'm doing is foreshadowing a talk that we will have in a couple of weeks on estimating and tracking again. And we'll see there's actually two different ways to track on something called a burn down chart, which is like an earned value diagram. We can track how much work's being done. We can also, and probably more importantly, track how much business value, how much value we're delivering to the customer at what rate over time during a sprint. We'll get to that. But we have to have these mechanisms in place in order to do that later. Okay. Summary. All right. So that's it for user stories. Very important things to remember here. First, user stories are a placeholder for a conversation. They are not the requirement. They are the conversation, and it's the token. It's the thing that reminds you of the conversation, which is that common understanding of the customer need between customers, product owners, developers, everybody on the team. User stories are the currency of the backlog. So when I gave you that Scrum diagram before with those green boxes, I said, oh, those are user stories. We'll talk about them later. Now you know what actually goes on the backlog. The backlog is populated with these things, with the actual user story itself. All right. These tasks are not part of a backlog. Right. Make that clear. They're on a Scrum board to help manage work, but they're not on the backlog. The story is what is on the backlog. Their user stories are assigned usually relative business value as story points and prioritized in the product backlog. And then during sprint planning, you select, again, that negotiation process, and stories are selected and they go on the sprint backlog. Good user stories, written in an active, goal-driven way, so we know who it is, we know why it's valuable to them, and we know what needs to be done, and they have an acceptance test, so we know what done looks like. Okay, so that's our user story summary. In this class on your project, you are going to be asked to write user stories and manage things on a Scrum board. It is going to be an approximation of a true process because you don't actually have a product owner, which means the team is collectively going to have to write some of these things. I reserve the right, as do my my TAs and graders. We're going to be added to your teams on the Scrum board, and we reserve the right to populate your product backlog as well on the outside. And we'll occasionally do that, but we can't do it for everybody for the entire set of requirements. So instead, what we'll do is we'll let you write a number of stories representing things that in ways you want to enhance an existing product, and then we'll periodically add a few of our own that we like. All right, and that's how that works. So moving forward, this is really everything you need to get started in an Agile process. Additional Agile modules we'll do periodically now, going forward every couple weeks. Estimating and tracking, as I said, will be the next one. We'll talk about continuous integration and testing. We'll talk about how to do a retrospective for both a sprint and a project.